The dust kicked up by Samuel Hayes's horse settled slowly in the evening air as he rode along the winding trail toward Cedar Ridge. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson that reminded him of better days, days when hope hadn't yet been buried beneath years of regret and whiskey. His weathered hands gripped the reins loosely, muscle memory guiding his mount along the familiar path he'd traveled countless times in his work as a circuit rider, delivering mail and supplies to the scattered settlements across the territory. Samuel was a man carved from the harsh landscape itself, tall and lean, with deep lines etched around his eyes from squinting against the relentless sun. His beard, once auburn like autumn leaves, now carried streaks of silver that caught the dying light. At 42, he looked older, worn down by the weight of choices that had driven him from his family and into the solitary life of a wanderer. The bottle in his saddlebag had become his most constant companion, offering temporary refuge from memories that refused to fade. As his horse rounded a bend in the trail, Samuel's attention was caught by an unexpected sight. There, sitting on a fallen log beside the dusty road, was a small figure that seemed out of place in the vast wilderness. He pulled his horse to a stop, his eyes focusing on what appeared to be a child, hunched over and sobbing with the kind of heartbreak that seemed too deep for someone so young. The sound of her crying carried on the evening breeze, a mournful melody that stirred something in Samuel's chest that he'd thought long dead. He dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. The child looked up at his approach, revealing the tear-streaked face of a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her dark hair was tangled and dusty, her simple dress torn and stained from what appeared to be days of travel. But it was her eyes that stopped Samuel cold, large hazel eyes that seemed to hold depths of sadness far beyond her years. "Easy there, little one," Samuel said softly, his voice rusty from disuse. He approached her the way he might approach a spooked horse, slowly and with his hands visible. "What are you doing out here all alone? Where's your family?" The girl looked up at him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "They're gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the evening wind. "The men came and they took them away. I hid like Papa told me to, but when I came out everyone was gone." Samuel felt his heart clench at her words. He'd heard too many stories like this in recent months, raiders and outlaws preying on isolated homesteads, taking what they wanted and leaving destruction in their wake. He crouched down to her level, noting the way she trembled despite the warm evening air. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked gently. "Rose," she replied, wiping her nose on her sleeve. "Rose Miller. My papa said if anything ever happened, I should try to find the town of Cedar Ridge. He said there might be someone there who could help me." The name hit Samuel like a physical blow. Miller. He'd known a Miller family once years ago, in another life that felt like a distant dream. But this child was too young, too unfamiliar. Still, something about her features nagged at him, a resemblance he couldn't quite place. "Well, Rose Miller," he said, standing up and brushing the dust from his knees. "You're in luck. I happen to be heading to Cedar Ridge myself. How about you ride with me? We can figure out what to do once we get there." Rose nodded eagerly, relief flooding her young face. Samuel lifted her onto his horse, noting how light she felt in his arms, how her small body shook with exhaustion and fear. He mounted behind her, wrapping his coat around her small frame as they resumed their journey through the gathering dusk. As they rode, Rose began to talk, her voice growing stronger as she sensed safety in Samuel's presence. She told him about her life on the small ranch where she'd lived with her parents, about the garden her mother had tended, about the way her father had taught her to ride and rope. With each word, Samuel felt an increasingly familiar ache in his chest, memories of his own daughter surfacing like ghosts from a half-forgotten past. "My real mama died when I was born," Rose said quietly, her head resting against Samuel's chest. "But Papa found me a new mama, and she loved me just like I was her own. They told me stories about my first mama sometimes, about how she had pretty brown hair and loved to sing." Samuel's hands tightened on the reins. His wife, Margaret, had died in childbirth 8 years ago, leaving him with a daughter he'd named Rose after her mother's favorite flowers. But in his grief and his guilt, he'd given the child away to a family who could provide for her better than a broken, down cowboy who'd turned to drinking to numb his pain. He'd told himself it was for the best, that she'd be better off without him. "What did your papa look like?" Samuel asked, his voice carefully neutral. Rose was quiet for a moment, then said, "Was tall, like you." and he had kind eyes, even when he was sad. Mama said he used to be sad a lot before I came to live with them, but that I made him happy again. The description could have fit any number of men, but Samuel's heart was racing now. Pieces of a puzzle he'd been afraid to solve clicking into place. He'd given his daughter to Tom and Sarah Miller, a young couple who desperately wanted children, but couldn't have any of their own. He'd watched from a distance as they'd built a life with her, had even received occasional letters about her progress until he'd moved on, unable to bear the constant reminder of what he'd lost. By the time they reached Cedar Ridge, the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The town was small but bustling, with oil lamps flickering in the windows of the saloons and general stores that lined the main street. Samuel guided his horse toward the boarding house where he usually stayed, his mind racing with questions he wasn't sure he was ready to have answered. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house owner, was a motherly woman in her 50s who'd taken a shine to Samuel during his previous visits. She came out to greet them, her face immediately softening when she saw Rose. "Oh, you poor dear," she said, reaching up to help Rose down from the horse. "Samuel, where did you find this little angel? On the road?" Samuel replied, dismounting and taking his saddlebags. "Her family was taken by raiders. She's looking for help." Henderson clucked her tongue sympathetically and gathered Rose into her arms. "Well, you've come to the right place, sweetheart. Let's get you cleaned up and fed, and then we'll figure out what to do next." As Mrs. Henderson led Rose inside, Samuel lingered by his horse, unsaddling the animal with mechanical precision while his thoughts churned. He needed to know for certain, but he was terrified of what he might discover. If this child was truly his daughter, then he'd failed her twice, first by giving her away, and now by being unable to protect the family that had taken her in. Inside the boarding house, Rose sat at the kitchen table, clean and wearing one of Mrs. Henderson's borrowed nightgowns that pooled around her small frame. She ate the simple meal of bread and stew with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. Samuel sat across from her, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to work up the courage to ask the questions that burned in his throat. "Rose," he said finally, "do you remember anything about your life before you went to live with the Millers? You said your mama died when you were born, but do you remember anything else?" Rose looked up from her bowl, her spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "Not much," she said slowly, "but sometimes I dream about a man who used to hold me and sing to me. He had a deep voice, and he smelled like leather and horses. Papa Miller said my first papa had to give me away because he was too sad to take care of me proper." Samuel's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as he set it down with shaking hands. The words were like arrows finding their mark, each one confirmation of what he'd begun to suspect. He remembered singing to his infant daughter during those long, sleepless nights after Margaret's death, remembered the way she'd curl against his chest, so small and perfect and heartbreakingly vulnerable. "What else did Papa Miller tell you about your first papa?" Samuel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rose's eyes grew distant, as if she were reaching back through the years to grasp fading memories. "He said his name was Samuel, and that he was a good man who'd lost his way. He said maybe someday, when I was older, I might want to find him and tell him it was okay, that I turned out all right." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He pushed back from the table abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Mrs. Henderson looked up from her mending with concern, but Samuel was already heading for the door, needing air, needing space to process what he'd just learned. Outside, the night air was cool and filled with the sounds of the frontier town settling into evening. Samuel walked to the edge of the porch and gripped the railing, his knuckles white with tension. His daughter, his Rose, had been sitting right there, and he'd been too much of a coward to claim her. Even now, knowing who she was, he felt the familiar urge to run, to disappear into the wilderness rather than face the responsibility of being her father. But as he stood there in the darkness, he heard the sound of soft footsteps behind him. Rose had followed him outside, her small bare feet padding across the wooden boards. She came to stand beside him, her head barely reaching his elbow. "Are you all right, mister?" she asked with the innocent concern of a child who'd learned too young to worry about the adults around her. Samuel looked down at her, this brave little girl who'd survived horrors that would have broken grown men, who'd maintained her faith in the goodness of people despite everything she'd endured. In her face, he could see traces of Margaret, the shape of her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw, but he could also see himself in the way she held her head, in the determined light in her eyes. "Rose," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something. About your first papa." She looked up at him with those hazel eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of someone much older. "I know," she said simply. "I figured it out when you asked me about him. You have the same voice from my dreams." Samuel's composure cracked then, and he sank down onto the porch steps, pulling Rose into his arms. She came willingly, as if she'd been waiting for this moment her entire short life. He held her close, this daughter he'd abandoned, this miracle he'd never dared hope to see again. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair. "I'm so sorry I left you. I thought you'd be better off without me." Rose pulled back to look at him, her small hands framing his weathered face. "Papa Miller used to say that everyone makes mistakes, but what matters is what you do after. He said you gave me away because you loved me too much to let me stay with someone who couldn't take care of me proper." The wisdom in her words shamed Samuel, even as they offered him a kind of absolution he'd never thought possible. Tom Miller had been a better father to her than he'd ever been, but perhaps it wasn't too late to try to be the father she needed now. "What do you want to do now, Rose?" he asked. "I can try to find you another family, people who can take care of you properly. I want to stay with you," she said firmly, "if you'll have me. I don't need another family, I need my papa." Samuel felt tears he hadn't shed in years burning his eyes. "I don't know if I can be a good father to you," he admitted. "I've made so many mistakes, and I'm not the same man I was when you were born." Rose smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since he'd found her on the road. Papa Miller used to say that being a good papa isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up and trying your best even when you're scared. That night, Samuel sat by Rose's bedside in the small room Mrs. Henderson had provided, watching his daughter sleep peacefully for the first time in days. Her face was relaxed in slumber, free from the worry and fear that had marked her features since he'd found her. He thought about the man he'd been 8 years ago, consumed by grief and guilt, convinced that he had nothing to offer a child who deserved so much more. But looking at Rose now, he began to understand that perhaps his greatest failure hadn't been in giving her away, but in believing that he was beyond redemption. Tom and Sarah Miller had given her a loving home and a stable childhood, things he couldn't have provided in his broken state. But now, tested by tragedy and loss, she'd found her way back to him, and perhaps that meant something. The next morning, Samuel made arrangements to buy a small plot of land on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge. It wasn't much, just enough for a modest cabin and a small garden, but it would be theirs. He'd saved enough money from his years of wandering to make a fresh start, and for the first time in nearly a decade, he had a reason to build something permanent. As they worked together to clear the land and lay the foundation for their new home, Samuel marveled at Rose's resilience. She threw herself into the work with the determination of someone much older, hauling water and gathering stones with a cheerfulness that belied everything she'd been through. When he asked her about it, she simply said that Papa Miller had taught her that hard work was good medicine for a troubled heart. The cabin began to take shape over the following weeks, with help from some of the townspeople who'd taken a shine to the quiet man and his remarkable daughter. Samuel found himself drinking less, sleeping better, and rediscovering parts of himself he'd thought were lost forever. Rose had a way of drawing out the best in people, and he began to understand why Tom Miller had said she'd made him happy again. One evening, as they sat on the steps of their nearly completed home, Rose asked him about her mother. Samuel had been dreading this conversation, but he found the words came easier than he'd expected. He told her about Margaret's laugh, about the way she'd loved to sing while she worked, about the garden she'd tended with such care. He told her about the joy they'd felt when they'd learned she was coming, and about the devastating grief that had followed her birth. "She would have loved you so much," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every good thing about you, every brave and kind thing you do, I see her in it." Rose leaned against his shoulder, her small hand finding his. "Do you think she knows about me? About us finding each other again?" Samuel looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "I think she does," he said. "I think she's been watching over you all along, making sure you found your way back home." As autumn turned to winter, their little cabin became a true home. Samuel found work as a deputy sheriff, his years of wandering having given him skills that were valuable in a frontier town. Rose started attending the local school, quickly making friends with her quick wit and generous spirit. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire, and Samuel would tell her stories of his travels, while she'd tell him about her lessons and her dreams for the future. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most to Samuel, the way Rose would slip her hand into his when they walked through town, the sound of her humming while she helped him with chores, the way she'd curl up against him when thunderstorms rolled through the valley. These were the moments he'd thought he'd lost forever, and their return felt like a miracle he didn't deserve, but was grateful for nonetheless. The winter passed peacefully, with Samuel and Rose settling into the rhythm of their new life together. Samuel threw himself into his work as deputy sheriff, finding purpose in protecting the community that had welcomed them. Rose excelled in school, her natural intelligence and curiosity making her a favorite among her teachers. But more than that, she brought joy to everyone she met, her resilience and optimism a testament to the strength of the human spirit. One snowy evening in December, as they sat by the fire after supper, Rose looked up from the book she was reading and said, "Papa, do you think the people who took the Millers will ever be caught?" Samuel had been dreading this question, knowing that Rose's nightmares still sometimes featured the men who'd destroyed her adoptive family. He set down his own book and looked at his daughter, considering his words carefully. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said honestly, "but I promise you this, no one will ever hurt you again. Not while I'm here to protect you." Rose nodded solemnly, then returned to her reading. Samuel watched her for a moment, marveling at her ability to carry such heavy burdens with such grace. She was stronger than he'd ever been, and he knew that strength came not from him, but from the love and guidance of the Millers, who'd raised her to be the remarkable person she was becoming. As spring approached, Samuel began to notice changes in Rose. She was growing taller, her face losing some of its childish roundness. She was becoming more confident, more sure of herself and her place in the world. But perhaps most importantly, she was beginning to talk about the future with excitement rather than fear. "I want to be a teacher when I grow up," she announced one morning over breakfast. "Like Miss Andrews at school. I want to help children learn and grow, just like she's helping me." Samuel smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "I think you'd make a wonderful teacher, Rose. You have so much to give to the world." One spring morning, nearly a year after they'd found each other, Samuel was working in the garden when Rose came running from the schoolhouse, her face flushed with excitement. She'd won a contest for her essay about heroism, and the prize was a trip to the territorial capital to read it aloud at a special ceremony. "I wrote about you, Papa," she said, throwing her arms around his neck. "About how you found me when I was lost, and how you taught me that it's never too late to start over." Samuel held her close, his heart full in a way he'd never thought possible. "I think you've got it backwards, sweetheart," he said. "You're the one who found me. You're the one who taught me about starting over." The day of the ceremony arrived with fanfare that seemed almost overwhelming for their quiet frontier town. Rose wore a new dress that Mrs. Henderson had sewn specially for the occasion, her hair braided with ribbons that caught the morning light. Samuel had polished his best boots and combed his hair with unusual care, wanting to look worthy of standing beside his remarkable daughter. They traveled to the territorial capital by stagecoach. Rose pressed against the window to watch the countryside roll by. She chattered excitedly about her speech, about the other children who would be there, about the important people who would hear her words. Samuel found himself both proud and nervous, remembering his own childhood fear of speaking in public and marveling at his daughter's confidence. The ceremony was held in the grandest building Rose had ever seen, with high ceilings and polished floors that reflected the light from crystal chandeliers. Samuel watched from the audience as Rose took the stage, looking impossibly small behind the large podium. But when she began to speak, her voice carried clearly through the hall, strong and sure. "My name is Rose Miller Hayes," she began, "and I want to tell you about a hero who doesn't think he's a hero at all." She spoke about the night he'd found her on the road, about his kindness to a frightened child, about the way he'd given her not just shelter but a home. She talked about the garden they'd planted together, about the stories he'd told her about her mother, about the way he'd shown her that love could survive even the darkest times. "Some people think heroes are the ones who fight battles and save towns," Rose said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But I think heroes are the ones who show up when you need them most, who help you find your way home, who teach you that it's never too late to start over. My papa taught me that the most important thing isn't where you've been, but where you're going. And because of him, I'm going somewhere good." The audience erupted in applause, but Samuel barely heard it. He was thinking about the broken man he'd been just a year ago, about the child he'd given away in his grief, about the miraculous chain of events that had brought them back together. Rose had called him a hero, but he knew the truth. She was the hero of their story, the brave little girl who'd refused to give up hope even when everything seemed lost. After the ceremony, they walked through the territorial capital's streets, Rose still glowing with the excitement of her triumph. They visited shops and restaurants, marveling at the bustle of the big city, but both of them seemed eager to return to their quiet life in Cedar Ridge. "Papa," Rose said as they sat in the hotel restaurant that evening, "do you think the Millers would be proud of me, of us?" Samuel reached across the table to take her hand. "I think they'd be very proud," he said. "Tom Miller was a good man, and he raised you to be a good person. I think he'd be happy to know that you're safe and loved." Rose nodded thoughtfully. "I miss them," she said, "but I'm glad we found each other. I think maybe everything that happened was supposed to happen so we could be together now." Samuel squeezed her hand gently. "I think you might be right," he said. "I think maybe some things are meant to be, even when they seem impossible." The journey back to Cedar Ridge was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Rose dozed against Samuel's shoulder, worn out from the excitement of the day. Samuel watched the familiar landscape roll by, thinking about the changes that had come into his life since that evening when he'd found a crying child on the road. He'd gained more than just a daughter. He'd gained a purpose, a reason to be better than he'd been. Rose had shown him that redemption was possible, that the worst mistakes of his past didn't have to define his future. She'd taught him that love could survive separation, that family was more than blood, that hope could bloom even in the harshest soil. As the stagecoach pulled into Cedar Ridge, Samuel felt a deep sense of homecoming. The town looked the same as always, but he saw it differently now, not as a temporary stop on an endless journey, but as home. The place where he and Rose were building their life together. That night, as Rose slept in her own bed in their little cabin, Samuel sat on the porch and looked up at the stars. He thought about Margaret, about the woman who'd given him the greatest gift of his life and then been taken away too soon. He thought about Tom and Sarah Miller, who'd loved Rose as their own and raised her to be the remarkable person she'd become. And he thought about the long, winding road that had brought them all together, a road that had seemed to lead nowhere but had actually been leading home all along. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the promise of summer in the air. Samuel woke to the sound of Rose humming in the kitchen, a melody he recognized as one of Margaret's favorite songs. He dressed quickly and joined her, finding her cooking breakfast with the competence of someone much older than her years. "Good morning, Papa," she said, beaming at him. "I made your favorite, flapjacks with honey." Samuel sat down at the table, watching his daughter move around the kitchen with easy familiarity. Everything about this moment felt precious to him. The morning light streaming through the windows, the smell of coffee and flapjacks, the sound of Rose's voice as she chattered about her plans for the day. "Rose," he said suddenly, "I need you to know something. Finding you on that road was the best thing that ever happened to me. You saved me, sweetheart. You brought me back to life." Rose came to sit beside him, her small hand finding his. "You saved me too, Papa," she said. "You gave me a home and a family. You taught me that even when everything seems lost, there's always hope." Samuel pulled her into his arms, holding her close. Outside, the world was waking up, birds singing, neighbors calling to each other, the distant sound of cattle lowing in the fields. It was an ordinary morning in an ordinary town, but to Samuel, it felt like the most extraordinary moment of his life. As they sat there together in the morning light, father and daughter reunited against all odds, Samuel knew that their story was far from over. There would be more challenges ahead, more joys and sorrows to share. But whatever came, they would face it together, bound by love and the unbreakable ties of family. The road that had led them apart had ultimately led them back together, and now they were home. Not just in the little cabin they'd built with their own hands, but in the love they'd found in each other's hearts. The girl he'd found crying on the road had indeed been his daughter, lost and now found. But she'd also been his salvation, the light that had guided him back from the darkness of his own making. In saving her, she had saved him, and together they'd built something beautiful from the ashes of their separate sorrows. The Wild West had always been a place where people came to start over, to leave their past behind and build something new. But sometimes Samuel realized the greatest frontier wasn't the land stretching endlessly before them. It was the territory of the human heart, with all its capacity for healing, forgiveness, and love. And in that territory, he and Rose had found their way home at last,